Hello everybody, I'm the introverted astrologer and I'm delighted to be back today with a video that many of you have been waiting for. A warm welcome to any new subscribers and my particular thanks to the viewer who so very kindly provided the birth time for today's video, which is of course JD Vance. Looking at a birth chart with a birth time is like opening a delicious bag of sweets. There is so much more information that I can now give you today. We already knew that Vance was being affected by some of the generational transits, and I covered those in my earlier video on him, so I'll put the link for that video below in the description box. But some of the information I have to give you today is highly relevant to that birth time, so please join me at the computer now and I'll show you what I mean. Throughout this video, I'll try to show you both the Placidus and the whole sign charts where I can. I'll also consistently use Vance's birthplace as the reference place when we take a look at any returns. So let's recap on some of the character analyses that we did in my earlier video. As you can see, Vance shares with Donald Trump. That Leo ascendant and the fixed star Regulus is within a couple of degrees of it. We know that Regulus comes with the chances of honours and potentially a prominent role in society. We had already picked up on that very close square between Mars and Venus, but the roles of these two planets are now emphasised tremendously by the fact that both of them are on an angle. That Mars in Scorpio in particular is very much strengthened by this position because it's also the ruler of Scorpio. We can also see that Vance and Trump share midheavens that aren't too far away from each other, although Vance's is slightly earlier. This means that Uranus would have been activating his midheaven by transit and his Mars during 2023. Now we can see that the Placidus house system places that Sun and Venus in the 12th house. I am actually more persuaded by the whole sign chart, which places these planets in the 1st house. You could argue that he would exhibit the traits of both 12th and 1st house, but I suspect you'd have to live with him to establish that. 12th house suns require a great deal of time alone and introspection. Venus is very prominent by being placed close to the ascendant, and so would probably give a great deal of attractiveness to Vance, and it could heighten his chances of being able to bring skill, diplomacy and popularity wherever he goes. Because we now have a birth time, we can see that the Sun and Chiron are actually very closely parallel, and they are on Vance's midheaven in the declinations. So the qualities of being noteworthy and charismatic are going to shine out of him in his public role and on the public stage. And Saturn's qualities are emphasised because in the declinations, Saturn is actually parallel to his descendant. We could envisage this bringing traits of loyalty, of longevity in his relationships, which has so far been the case. The transits for the 5th of November are arranged around the outside of this birth chart in green. And what we're focusing on right now is the position of the outer planets. Now that we have a birth time, we know that transiting Uranus is not only squaring that Venus, but it is also going to be square to that ascendant. This really emphasises the amount of flux that we had already discussed in my earlier video. Uranus is a planet of disruption and change and also freedom, and so old relationships may well break down if they cannot accommodate freedom and change. A good, stable marriage may well survive this, provided it is flexible enough to allow change in. So for JD, this is going to be a time of new faces and new places at great speed, and many of these relationships will not necessarily survive after the transit has passed over. This is also telling us that transiting Uranus is in his 10th house. Trump too is experiencing transiting Uranus moving through his 10th house, and the 10th house is our public facing role, what we do in the world and how wider society perceives us. So both of this team are having more heavyweight 10th house transits. Trump is currently experiencing Uranus on his midheaven and square his Mars. Uranus isn't actually going to square Trump's ascendant until next year. We can also now confirm where Jupiter is transiting in JD's chart. It is moving through the 10th Placidus house, and we can also see that it will be making a helpful sextile contact with JD's natal sun, and a little later this year it will begin to form a trine with his moon. And these are lovely transits for the feel-good factor, for attracting fortunate circumstances to ourselves, for feeling hopeful and optimistic. They aren't of themselves a guarantee of success in election, but they will certainly help us promote our cause and assist us with presenting an optimistic, relaxed and happy exterior. We were already aware of some generational activity from Neptune and Pluto, which would likely bring additional change and re-evaluation. But for a discussion of those, please do refer to my earlier video. What I really want to concentrate on in this video are the progressions and the solar arcs. And we now have some critical information that will help us to forecast. Now here we have JD's chart in the centre again, and outside the edge of the circle you can see some planets that are in green. These are the progressed planets. When we looked at this chart without the birth time, there was very little activity that we could see, and I felt a bit stumped. But now that we have a birth time, we can see something very important is happening. JD's ascendant and midheaven have also been moving in the progressions, and both of these points are shortly going to change sign. Now this is immensely important because we often have a sign change when we are entering a whole new part of our life. It's an alert. We know that something big is shifting. I find this very interesting because I had noticed with Trump's progressed planets and his solar return that from mid-2025 onwards, things also improve rapidly for him. But what else can we pick up from these progressed angles? Well, the progressed ascendant is roughly here at 29 degrees of Virgo, and that midheaven is roughly 29 degrees of Gemini. And what is happening is that they are joining in to form a contact with Vance's natal Neptune. Now usually we think of contacts with Neptune as bringing some difficulty. Things tend to get blurred. They could become confused. We may lose our footing. Neptune tends to break things down by a gradual and disorientating dissolving. But we do also need to bear in mind that natal Neptune is actually forming a trine aspect with the ascendant, and so this may not be a wholly unpleasant experience for Vance, because in actuality a part of his natal promise is being reactivated by the ascendant, again forming an aspect with Neptune. Now both the progressed ascendant and midheaven have passed the point of exactitude, but they're still very much in focus because we are well within a degree of orb. The progressed midheaven is also simultaneously forming a trine aspect with JD's natal Pluto. So there is potentially that drive for transformation and power. The trine aspect has the reputation of removing any friction or resistance. And so there is this drive to transform, to change and to remodel our midheaven goals. And yet at the same time, that Neptune may put a damper on things. We can also look at the relationship between the progressed sun and the progressed moon. They tell us that JD is in the progressed full moon stage of the lunation cycle. And in a way, this is a peak, and there is very much a 4th, 10th house dynamic to this. So we may be reaching the peak in our career, and at the same time, we may also be reaching an anticlimax. There are no guarantees of success, but this particular phase is telling us of intensity in our goals. And for many people, this may be a time when they decide to leave the old life behind, or to physically relocate themselves and change home. JD will be in this phase for a few years yet, and we can also associate this phase with our attitudes becoming more polarised, more black and white, potentially more extreme. And certainly at this part of the lunation cycle, our desire will be to release our energy out into the world. That progressed moon is moving through the sign of Aries. The Placidus system has it here in the 8th house of intensity, of beginnings and endings, and potentially crisis. The whole sign house has it in the 9th house, of broadening our horizons, of enlarging on our belief systems, of expansion and potentially joy. Now, the progressed moon shifted into Aries in late May of 2024, and this progressed moon will move roughly 12 degrees during the course of a year. This means that we can track it month on month as it moves forward, and we can work out whether it makes any aspects to the natal chart. And so using this method, we can see that this progressed moon is going to form a square aspect with the natal Jupiter, becoming exact in very early October. So in the few weeks leading up to October and during October, JD will need to be on guard against overstretching himself. This can be a time when we overestimate our resources, be they physical, emotional, or mental. If we move on now and consider the solar arc aspects, there really isn't very much to cover, which is what we had found in my previous video. Aside from the changes with the progressed ascendant and midheaven, there isn't the volume of activity going on in JD's progressions and solar arcs that I had found for Camilla. The solar arc planets are arranged around the birth chart in blue, and there is very little interconnection between them and Vance's birth chart. This seems quite surprising, given that we're leading up to a presidential election. I'll also point out that there will be many more solar arc contacts which become exact as we move further into 2025. And we also know that the progressed ascendant in midheaven will change sign going into 2025. And so 2025 is looking far busier for JD for some reason. I also considered how eclipses might affect this chart, but there isn't any notable impact within a couple of degrees of orb, and neither is there any contact from the transiting North Node, which is reversing slowly through Aries. I also considered Chiron, and it is actually completing a trine transit with that natal Venus, which will be out of the way after July, and certainly not in orb during the November election. However, transiting Chiron will form an opposition to that natal moon within a degree during the November elections. This certainly wouldn't be a deal breaker, but it will be an extra niggle. We could feel somewhat isolated during this opposition transit from Chiron. I think we should consider the solar return now that we have a birth time, and see if we can pick up any big shifts in our life direction. And so we have 3 charts here. The chart on our left is JD's solar return on its own, and it spans a period from his birthday in early August of 2024 through to his next birthday, which is in 2025. The chart on our right has got JD's natal chart in the centre, and arranged around the outside are the solar return planets, which we will look at soon. The small chart in the centre is the whole sign version. I must apologise, but I found it impossible to fit everything into one screen. So this chart has JD's natal chart in the centre, and the solar return placements are placed around the outside. And we'll look at the standalone solar return chart first. And on first glance, this looks quite promising. We have the sun on the cusp of the 5th house. If we were using whole signs, this would still be a 5th house sun, because of course the ascendant is in very late Aries. We have that wide opposition between the sun and Pluto in the 10th Placidus house, of career, of our public standing. Pluto speaks of transformation, of an increase in power potentially, because there is an Aries ascendant. The ruler of this chart is Mars, which is placed in the 2nd house together with Jupiter. The midheaven is in Capricorn, and Saturn is the ruler of that midheaven. Saturn is placed in the 12th house, whichever house system you use, and it squares that Jupiter and forms a trine aspect with the Sun, which is prominent on the nadir of the chart. The ascendant is quite interesting because it is receiving a very tight square aspect from Pluto up in the 10th. Chiron is a few degrees away, and this ascendant is also on the midpoint of Saturn and Jupiter. And so we have a combination of things which are promising and others which are more challenging, but we should never consider the solar return on its own. And so we'll move over to the right-hand side of the screen and consider the return and how it interacts with JD's natal chart. We can see that the ascendant of the solar return is falling into the 9th house, the house of belief systems, of enlarging our minds, of our philosophies, and potentially of long-distance travel too. Can we see any close conjunctions being made between the angles of the solar return and Vance's natal chart? When we are going to have a big change in our lives, in our career, in our standing, we often have interplay between the solar return angles and the natal chart. What we can pick up is that JD's natal Pluto is quite closely conjunct to the descendant of the solar return. The ascendant is at 29 degrees of Aries and Pluto is at 29 degrees of Libra. So we are having big changes in our formal relationships. The descendant marks the beginning of the 7th house, and the 7th house is all about formal relationships, one-to-one relationships, open enemies, and Pluto here is promising big overhaul and change between August of 24 and August of 25. There is no interplay between the midheaven and Vance's natal planets, and the solar return moon in Cancer is introducing themes of home, of mother, of emotional security by virtue of the Cancer sign. But there's not a great deal of interconnection with JD's natal planets. We can, however, pick up that the solar return Mars is falling very close to JD's natal Chiron. I'm not so keen on this one, and it is emphasising that natal T-square that JD has between Uranus, Chiron and Mercury. I do wonder if there are some things that are not going to go our way with this combination of planets. Mercury and Mars can speak of arguments and crosswords, but it wouldn't be terrible to have it in a solar return for a year when we need to engage in a huge volume of communication, of interaction, of speeches. That would be appropriate. Venus is actually quite nearby to the ascendant. The solar return Venus is at 26 odd degrees of Leo, and Vance's ascendant is 27 odd degrees. But we must still factor in the fact that even though Venus is the lesser benefic, and her presence here would certainly help in promoting a socially engaging and attractive outward face, it is also accentuating the fact that there is this Uranus square Venus transit going on the solar return is showing us the importance of this too, because that Uranus is simultaneously squaring Venus and the ascendant. The solar return Jupiter is around 14 degrees of Gemini, and we know that it has actually formed a sextile transit with Vance's Sun and will be in a trine with his natal moon later this year. But there's very little contact between Jupiter and Vance's natal angles, or indeed the angles of the solar return. And so I don't find this solar return particularly strong. What we are doing is taking note of JD's natal Mars, which we know is at 22 degrees and 28 minutes of Leo. As this year unfolds, Mars will be moving through the various signs, and as we near election, the last point at which Mars is at 22 degrees and 32 minutes of any sign is on the 16th of October, when it is in the sign of Cancer and is at the exact same degree as JD's natal Mars. In other words, what we're doing is tracking that Mars by its exact natal degree, but not by its exact natal sign. And so because this is a more fleeting return, we need to consider it very simply. We will be looking at the angles of this chart against the angles of JD's natal chart, and we will be delineating in very simple and brief terms. This was an exercise that we recently did for Kamala Harris, and we will repeat for any other candidates too. This particular return period for JD covers the election period itself, but also the presidential inauguration. Why are we using Mars in this way? Well, Mars, of all the planets, is the one most likely to signify competition, battles, that ability to get out there and get what we want for ourselves. And so there is a lot of overlap with the battle, the race to become the new president. We have that emphasis on belief systems again, because the ascendant is in Sagittarius. JD's natal planets are placed around the outside of the chart in red, and we can see that this ascendant is bringing to the forefront a T-square that JD has in his natal chart. This is because his Mercury in Virgo squares both Uranus and Chiron, and so there is some oversensitivity or wounding in the area of our speech, our mental processing, our interaction, and we did cover this in my earlier video. Well, this T-square is becoming prominent again. Does this mark a time when these issues are going to become very much centre stage? This square between Uranus and Mercury suggests somebody who may sometimes be a little quick to pass comment, or potentially to say things too speedily, which they then have to retract or repent over. And Chiron indicates that this may be an area of some sensitivity or wounding. Is there any other interaction between the angles? JD's natal midheaven is in the area of the part of fortune and of Uranus, and so this is suggesting some change. JD's natal Uranus is around 9 degrees of Sagittarius, and so that too is hovering near this ascendant. We have a double whammy here of Uranus to an angle. Is there anything else unusual about this chart that we can see? That natal Mars is falling in the 12th house of this return, and that's not so good. In Kamala's case, we had seen that her natal Mars had actually fallen strong on the descendant, on the cusp of the 7th house. And we know that the 12th house can be a place of hidden enemies, of loss, of sacrifice and confusion. Do we have any unusual aspect patterns within the return chart? Jupiter, for example, is at 21 degrees, and so we can see a very tight sextile with a Chiron also at that same degree. And there is also a trine between Jupiter and the Sun. But in Kamala's case, the pattern was much stronger because she had Chiron, Jupiter, Sun and Mars all at 21 degrees. and this chart is not that strong. And so on balance, Camilla's Mars return on a specific degree was stronger. And on the information that we've seen so far during this video, I rate her position as being stronger. However, I think we should suspend judgment until we have used our converse techniques and weighed the two candidates up against each other. In Camilla's case, we tracked back in time and found her converse progressions and solar arcs. And so I will cover this for JD Vance and have that video with you in a few days' time. I hope you found that informative. I still feel a little mystified as to why the latter part of 2025 looks very busy and positive for both Vance and Trump. Is that just a coincidence? Now, in my next video, I'll do for Vance what I've done for the other candidates. We'll go back in time. We'll look at the converse progressions and have a peek at that solar return. Until then, though, please do take very good care of yourselves. God bless you and your families.